Hi, I'm Andrew Connell, and I'm an MVP for Office Servers and Services. And in this module, we're going to look at building ASP.NET MVC web apps with the Microsoft Graph. We're going to first start with an introduction to the Microsoft Graph API, and then jump into some getting started stuff and what's involved in creating an app. And we'll look at the SDKs, some code samples, and finally look at some resources. Microsoft's Office 365 developer vision focuses on the user's experience and their data. As a developer, you can bring your applications into their user experience. So with over 1.2 billion users of Office worldwide, this is a huge opportunity to provide a window into your different applications, as well as being able to connect into their data and add intelligence to your applications. There are currently 850 million events created a month and a total of 470 petabytes and more of data stored in the service that can add value to and for our users of your applications. So what does it look like to build an application that's going to be integrated with Office 365? Well, as you can see at the very bottom here, we've got access to a lot of different data sources inside of Office 365. And the best way to get to them is using the Microsoft Graph API. That Microsoft Graph API is going to essentially act as a proxy to all of these different services that are available to us. Now, in order to call the Microsoft Graph, we're going to have to first authenticate, and we're going to do that using Azure AD. And that's going to allow us to authenticate either using our consumer accounts, like a Microsoft account, or using our work and school account, or like an Azure AD based identity that we would use in Office 365. You also are going to be able to leverage the OpenID Connect, which is going to give us the ability to get some information about the currently logged on user. Now, once we are authenticated, we then have the option of many different ways that we can talk to the Microsoft Graph. And the way we're going to do that is using different environments. Now, in the case of this scenario, we're going to be looking at using Android Studio and working with a strong API SDK for the Microsoft Graph. And then we can build our application using anything else that we want to end up using here. So in this case here, we're going to build one that's going to show events from a calendar in Office 365. Now let's talk a little bit about authentication and how this works with the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph leverages Azure Active Directory, or Azure AD, like so many other cloud services from Microsoft. And this is going to provide authentication and authorization capabilities for our applications. You can create web apps as well as native apps with Azure AD apps. And in addition, users can authorize the application using the delegated consent, where they grant the application to act on their behalf. Global tenant admins can also grant consent to all users as a different type of consent. We call that the admin consent. Azure AD application authentication is implemented using the OAuth 2 protocol. So users are redirected to Azure for authentication credentials so that the custom applications never get the actual credentials of the user. We just redirect them over to Azure, and then Azure is going to give us back some information, or give the user some information that they will provide the application to log in. Depending on the authentication flow that we leverage, the app is ultimately going to get an access token that's only valid for a specific amount of time for a specific user with specific permissions and for a specific resource. In our case here, that's the Microsoft Graph. These access tokens can be refreshed after they expire using an associated refresh token. And the login process also supports multi-factor authentication and federated authentication that Microsoft's Azure AD supports. Now, native applications differ from web applications in a few different ways because first, they're multi-tenant by default, and you don't need to worry about sending app credentials or app secrets when the native app is distributed, because it can't contain a secret, because once you distribute the app, it's never really going to be a secret. So instead, we're going to use some special redirection URLs. Now, all Office 365 cloud services, including SharePoint Online and the Microsoft Graph, leverage Azure AD for authentication and authorization. And this means there is a single authentication flow that we're going to use for Office 365 applications, as well as those that are created to leverage the Microsoft Graph. Office 365 has some direct API endpoints, and this is for all the different services that you may invoke, things like Outlook or OneDrive or OneNote. Direct endpoints have new functionality before it's going to be exposed to the Microsoft Graph API. That would include things like Outlook webhooks or time zones on a calendar. The direct endpoints are going to get those first. However, what you are going to be able to do is eventually those things will make it to the Microsoft Graph. So the Microsoft Graph acts as a proxy to these other endpoints, but you may see functionality show up in those direct endpoints first before you see it show up in the Microsoft Graph, where they will add support for it eventually. Let's talk about the single authentication flow for Office 365. Users are going to first sign in using OpenID Connect. Now that's an extra layer on top of the Azure AD OAuth authentication, and that's going to give you some identity information in the response once a user authenticates. Azure AD and Office 365 services can leverage this authentication model, and it supports both Microsoft federated authentications or multi-factor authentications and federated user sign-ins. We can do work with device apps, websites, single-page applications, and service apps as well. And then finally, we can also pin applications to the Office 365 app launcher from the app launcher that we have, or the My Apps page inside of Office 365. The authentication endpoint is also going to allow us to have this thing called the Common Consent Framework. And what that does is that's going to allow us to define permissions that our application is going to need, and our users are going to have a common interface that they're going to see that they have to go through to support that authentication or to approve those different kinds of requests. Now we have a couple different authentication options. You can authenticate using Azure AD, which it has a specific flow, or we can use Azure AD and Microsoft accounts. And the way this works is that the first one, Azure AD only, is the V1 endpoint for Azure AD using the ADAL libraries. The second one is the converged authentication option, where you can have, it's called a common or a converged authentication model, where the V2 endpoint for Azure AD allows us to sign in using our Microsoft account or our Azure AD account. And what that will then do is that'll let Azure AD figure out which underlying identity provider we're using, but it's transparent to the application, and a single token can work across both of them. Now, many apps want to sign users in from both Microsoft accounts and Azure AD. And what's nice about this V2 converged endpoint is that it's a single endpoint that supports both OpenID Connect and OAuth. So again, OpenID Connect is a layer on top of OAuth, which allows us to provide some identity information back in addition to an access token. It also is going to give us a single SDK instead of having to have two different SDKs for two different authentication models, a single end-user sign-in experience, a single app registration experience, and best of all is it works with the Microsoft Graph. So we simply have a single API endpoint that we can use to get both business data from Office 365 or consumer data from things like OneDrive Consumer or from Outlook.com. Now let's look at what's involved in creating an ASP.NET web application, and we're going to leverage MSAL and OWYN middleware for authentication with Azure AD. So we're first going to create the ASP.NET MVC web application, and I'm not going to use the wizard that's provided with Visual Studio, at least at the time of the recording, because it's not going to leverage the MSAL authentication library. It's going to leverage ADAL. It's in an older library because MSAL is still technically in preview at the time of this recording. I'm then going to go configure the application to make it default to SSL. So I'm saying I'm only going to be using the SSL endpoint for our application. And then I'm going to configure it for the Microsoft Authentication Library and OWYN middleware. And that's going to involve installing a few .NET NuGet packages and modifying the code for the project as well. So again, at the time of recording this screencast, the Microsoft Identity Client package, which is the Microsoft Authentication Library, is in pre-release. And that's so you want to make sure that you get the most recent pre-release packages by checking the box in Visual Studio when you download this into your project for using the NuGet package manager to ensure the pre-releases are listed, or if you're using the command line way of installing the packages, make sure you use the -pre switch on the command line to get the pre-release packages. Once the production bits are released, make sure you update your application to leverage the production version of the Microsoft Authentication library. Now that we have our application created and a bit of the UI flow has been set up, let's now see how to integrate Azure AD and Microsoft Authentication library into our application. So we're going to use the Microsoft Application Registration Portal. We're going to talk about configuring the credentials, selecting the type of the application, and then configuring the permissions for our application. The Application Registration Portal is located at apps.dev.microsoft.com, and what that's going to be is a place for you to register your V2-based authentication endpoint applications. And this is what's also going to trigger us to use the Microsoft Authentication library. You can create web applications, native applications, including mobile applications, and many other types. You're going to obtain an application ID and a secret for use in the custom solution from this site. Now we have two different sites we can use for registering an application. The Azure AD portal works with the V1 endpoint, and you're going to have to define the permissions or scopes ahead of time. It only supports Azure AD users. The Microsoft Graph supports both consumer or Microsoft accounts and the Azure AD based or work and school based logins as well for business users. So the Microsoft Graph team recommends that we use the V2 endpoint instead of just the V1 endpoint. This is going to allow us to have the converged authentication that works with both Microsoft accounts and Azure AD. And it's going to support dynamic consent to define the scopes and permissions at runtime. So let's look at what's involved in creating an Azure AD application with the App Registration Portal. So the first thing you're going to do is go to the App Registration Portal and register a new application. This is not creating the code base. This is just getting an ID for the application so that Azure AD knows who this is and knows what resources it has access to. You then are going to add a platform to it, and that's going to be either a web platform or a native platform for, like, say, a mobile-based application. The web platform is what we're going to use for our ASP.NET-based application. So we're going to add that, and then we're also going to need to specify the return URLs or redirect URLs, and that's where Azure AD will send the user back once they've successfully authenticated. And then you optionally can also define the permissions ahead of time, but the permissions can also be requested dynamically using the dynamic consent capability that we have in the V2 endpoint. In this demo, I want to show you how we can go about creating a web application, but first we need to register an Azure AD web application in the App Registration Portal. So what I've done first is I've navigated over to my apps.dev.microsoft.com site, which is the App Registration Portal. And I'm going to go ahead and log in with my account here. And this is a Azure AD account that I can use to log in with this. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new application. So I'm going to call this my test web application, and I'll go ahead and click create. Now, the first thing you want to do when you create this is grab this ID that gets created first, because we're going to need that inside of our application and a little bit later, because everywhere we want to use this app, we're going to definitely need that ID. Now, if I scroll down a little bit, I'm going to also want to create a password for my application. So I'm going to click the generate new password, and it's going to give me a password. I need to make sure that I copy this right away before I click OK, because it's only going to be shown to me one time. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then I'll click OK. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a platform. So the platform I'm going to add for this one is a web platform. So I'll come over here and I'll click web, and it's going to ask me to add in any URLs that I want to use for my application. So just for now, I'm just going to say HTTPS localhost :1234. All All right, now this is not going to be something we're going to use. We're going to have to come back to this to add in additional URLs in the future for applications we're going to create. Now, the next thing I'll do too is, while I can use dynamic permissions or for dynamic consent, I want to show you how to specify permissions. So I'm going to click Add under Delegated Permissions, and I'm going to scroll down a little bit to my calendars.read and click OK, because that's the permission that we're going to end up needing for our application. And then I'm going to go ahead and save it. So right now, everything is all set up. We're in pretty good shape. We don't really have anything else that we're going to need to do with this application. It's all ready to be used inside of another app that we're going to end up creating with either could be an ASP.NET app or just straight REST calls, but whatever it is, we've now got our app set up and we're good to go. In this demo, we're going to look at an ASP.NET MVC application and look at what was required to take the standard ASP.NET web app and add the Microsoft Authentication library, the MSAL, and OWN middleware, and then what we did to configure it so that it would work with an HTTPS request and to log in and get the current user and display his information. This is the predecessor to adding Microsoft Graph support for getting data using the REST API that we have for the Microsoft Graph. So what we did is I first went in and created this application. And if I look at the properties for this application, I went in and I made sure that his SSL enabled is set to true. So if I grab this URL here, one of the first things we're going to have to do is we're going to have to change the redirect URL for our web application that we've created previously that we want to use inside of this ASP.NET MVC app. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scroll down and I'm going to add in a new URL that is going to be a valid return URL that we can use. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that to an existing app that we're going to use in a minute. Now, another thing that we did is I then went in and after creating the application and after registering this app, I then came over to the web config and I added in all of these different values that you see here. So I have an app ID, an app secret, a redirect URI, and all of the different scopes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the URI to the URI of our project where we want to redirect someone back to. And I'm also going to need to go update the ID with the secret for the web application. So I'll go ahead and copy that in from a little snippet that we have off on the side. Just paste that in like this. And then let me go grab the password for the application as well, which is also known as the secret. All right, so we have all those values and we also have the scopes that are defined. Now the next thing I did is I had to go in and I had to add in, if I open up the package manager for the project, I had to go in and add a bunch of NuGet packages in for the OWN middleware and the Microsoft Authentication library. So what I did first, if I look at the ones that are currently installed, if you see here that I've got pre-releases that have been checked off. And what that's going to allow me to do is to find the Microsoft Identity Client. So this is the MSAL library, and it's got a bunch of dependencies that are associated with it. Not only did I grab that, but I also came down and found the OWN middleware that you see listed right here. I went ahead and installed that and the system web and security cookies and the OpenID Connect. I installed all of these different OWN middleware pieces here that were required. And once you choose this first one here by Microsoft OWN, it has a bunch of dependencies that it would have gone ahead and installed some of these for us. But what that's going to do is that's going to allow us to also work with the ID tokens that come back. So if you look at the packages config, just to clarify exactly what we did here is that I added in this identity, Microsoft Identity Client, and this Microsoft Identity Model tokens. Now it's going to have a dependency there, so it should pull that in. If not, then you need to make sure you add it. And then I also made sure that we have all of this OWN middleware that's listed here as well. and then this system identity model tokens JOT file as well. So I did all that and installed everything, and we now have all the dependencies that we need. The next step that we did is I came over here and I created this startup.cs file. And this is a partial class that is going to tie in to when the Owen middleware starts up, it's going to call this method here, this startup method that you see listed right here, which is going to be calling this configuration method that's going to call a method called configureauth. Now, I don't have all that defined here. Instead, we have in our app start, I have a startup auth file that I also created. And this file is the other side of the partial class for this startup. So I'm getting those same values that we put in our web config just a minute ago, and I have our configureauth method that we've defined. And here, this configureauth method is going to use cookie-based authentication, and then it's going to use OpenID Connect authentication. And what it's doing is it's creating the authentication option. So I'm creating a client ID, the authority, the redirect URIs, the scopes that we're looking for specifically for not only for OpenID, but also for the ones for the graph that we were looking for. And if I scroll down a little bit farther here, what I'm then doing is it's then going to set up the notification so that when we get an authorization code back, it's going to use that authorization code to then go acquire a token using the authorization code asynchronously. All right, so now that's going to effectively, all of that stuff is going to log us in. All right. Now, the next thing we did is under these helpers is I defined this IAuth provider helper here, which is going to have a method called get user access token async. So if I look at this sample auth provider that I also created here, what this one is going to do, let's go back to that, is I'm still getting those same values. I'm creating an instance of a token cache, which we'll see that in just a moment. Actually, there's a little token session token cache that I created over here, and we'll look at that in a moment. It is a singleton, so I'm getting a single instance to it, and I'm implementing this method of get user access token asynchronously. So here what I've done is I've created this confidential client application here, and passing in the ID, the redirect URI, the credentials of the currently logged in, or the application itself, which that's being collected from the application secret that I referenced earlier in the web config, and this token cache. And then it's going to call the, for the confidential client, it's going to call acquire token silently asynchronously. And what that does is that when that gets the result, that's going to get back an access token. And if not, then we have some different things that we can handle here for the different authentication options. So here, like this thing here is what's going to redirect me over to go log in that first time. Now, this session token cache, this is a very much a sample code here, but all it's doing is that when I authenticate with Azure AD and I get an access token and a refresh token back, I can store that locally so that maybe my application can use that instead of making another round trip in the future to obtain the access token. And what the silently bit does is that it's trying to use that from the token cache, and it says if it finds one and it's not expired, it'll use the one from the session cache or from the token cache. If it finds one and it's expired or it's about to expire, or it doesn't find one, that's when it's going to send the user over to the Azure AD authentication endpoint, authorization endpoint, to go log in and obtain a authorization code, which we can use to exchange it for an access token. This session token cache that we've created here, this is just storing the sessions in session state, which is maybe not the best option, but it works great for this little demo. Now, the last thing we did to actually make authentication work inside this app is I created an account controller, a new MVC controller. And this controller, it's got a sign in button, a sign out button. And what the sign in button does is it just simply says, let's go get an Owen context, and I'm going to issue a challenge. And that's going to redirect me back to my current application. Scroll a bit farther down. When I sign out, it's going to go get an instance of the token cache, and then it's going to try and sign that user out and then redirect them back to the main part of the app. Then we created a login experience. So underneath in the views, I created this login partial, and this view has a new link on it where what this login is going to do is it's going to say, are you currently authenticated? And if you're not, then I'm going to, let's get rid of the styles here. We're going to create this link here that says sign in, and that's going to take me to the account MVC controller. Otherwise, if I am authenticated, I'm going to show the name that I have for the person that we got out of the claims that came back, or more specifically, the OpenID ID token that came back. And I'm going to show a sign out button adjacent to that, right next to them. So let's take a look and see how this works. So I'm going to go over and spin this up. So I'll go ahead and just click the play button. And we can see here that it went ahead and immediately opened it up using the HTTP URL, not the HTTPS URL. So let's come back over here to our web application, and let's make sure we have that correct HTTPS endpoint. So I'll copy that, and I'll just paste that in because that's the real place where the app is. And here we are, we're running our web app. Now, if I click sign in with Microsoft, this should take me over to Azure AD. And if you notice from the other stuff that we've done, you can see the whole URL that's been created here for this authorization endpoint. And we've already used the app. So when I go to log in here and I pass in my username and my password, I am not going to be prompted to consent to the application because everything is, I've already consented to it. It's then going to redirect it back to my application, and sure enough, we can see that we've authenticated just fine because there is my name right there. So in this case, what you saw is what was required to configure an ASP.NET MVC application to log in with to Azure AD with the Microsoft Authentication library for the .NET client. The next step is to add some extra stuff to this to support the calls to the Microsoft Graph. So we'll see that in the next section. Now in this last section, let's incorporate the Microsoft Graph into our ASP.NET application. So we're going to see the NuGet packages that we're going to need, how to authenticate with Azure AD, and then how to create an instance of the Graph Service Client to issue and process the results. The first thing we need to do is we need to install the Microsoft Graph NuGet package. And thankfully there's only one. So you can do that straight from the command line, or you can install it from the Visual Studio NuGet management console or package manager. This is going to also install a couple dependency packages as well, such as the Microsoft Graph Core package, as well as the Newtonsoft.json JSON serialization and deserialization utility library. So how do we obtain a Graph Service Client, which is from the SDK or from the API? So the way I'm going to do this is I'm first going to obtain an access token from Azure AD by authenticating. And there's a couple different ways we can do that. I'm showing you one way here using an option here about acquire tokens silently asynchronously. And what that does is we have a token cache that we're going to define so that the first time I authenticate with my application, it's going to have to go out to Azure AD to authenticate and obtain an access token. But it will store that access token for later use. What that silently part of that method means is it says, I'm going to try to use the same token we used earlier, but if it doesn't work, then I'm going to have to redirect the user back over to get that access token, a refreshed version of that access token, because maybe it's expired and the refresh token no longer exists, or something else has changed that the one that we currently have no longer works. So silently says, try to use the exact same one without prompting the user, but if it doesn't work, then we're going to have to prompt the user. Then you're going to use that access token to create an instance of the Graph Service Client to call the Microsoft Graph API. So here I'm creating a new instance of the Graph Service Client, and I'm using the delegate authentication provider to obtain the access token and then add that to the request for header that every single request is going to be made over to the graph. So I have an authorization header that's going to be added to every single request to authenticate to the Microsoft Graph. So what's the experience look like? Well, the user's first going to be prompted to sign in once they click the sign in button, and then they're going to have to go log into Azure AD, and potentially, it depends if they've already used the app or not, they're going to be prompted to consent the application. And then once they do that, they go back to, or sent back to the web application, which is going to take a code and then send that code. It's going to use that code to request an access token from Azure AD. And that code that was issued by Azure AD and was returned back to the app is essentially Azure AD saying, we've authenticated this specific user to have these permissions, so we'll give him a token. Then we're just going to use that token to call the Microsoft Graph to get the data out of the Microsoft Graph. So overview of how the sample is going to work. We're going to go from the web app over, be redirected over to the authentication endpoint, which is login.microsoftonline.com. We're ultimately going to get an access token, and then we're going to use that access token to inside of our Graph client to issue a request for calendar items that will then come back from the Microsoft Graph. And the Microsoft Graph will use that token to authenticate me and then go to my calendar to get my information from my Office 365 calendar. Once the token is acquired, the application is going to call the Graph API without going through the steps to obtain the access token. It just caches it locally and keeps using it. But at some point, the token is going to expire, and a refresh token can be used to obtain a new access token without requiring the user to log in again. Now, to understand why this Microsoft Authentication library is important, it's necessary to understand what it's actually doing for you. And as I mentioned earlier, your code follows a simple pattern to acquire a token silently, and if that fails, it'll acquire it interactively. Your code doesn't need to manage the login pop-up screen, the interaction for obtaining consent, and it doesn't need to manage the token lifetimes. The call to the authorization endpoint will pop up a login screen and request permissions consent. But it's important to cache the refresh token to request a new access token. This is what MSAL is doing for you. There's no action for you as the developer to manage the refresh token. You can create a custom cache for persistence, but MSAL manages the token lifetime for you. It's important, however, to understand what this library actually does. In this demo, we're going to build off an existing ASP.NET MVC application to add support for calling the Microsoft Graph using the Microsoft Graph .NET SDK. Now, we're using the same project that we had finished with in the previous demo that has been configured for Microsoft Authentication, or MSAL, and authenticating with the Azure AD, and using the MSAL library to handle all the authentication, and the ON middleware to handle the OpenID piece for identity layer on top of it. Now, we've already gone ahead and we've already added all this code to make this work in the interest of time. So I'm going to walk through the parts of the project that have changed to show you how we added support for the Microsoft Graph. If you would like to build this exact same thing and see how this works yourself, there's a lab associated with this demo, with this screencast, that has an exercise that walks you through in step-by-step detail of how to do this. So one of the first things I did is I went to the NuGet package manager and I did a search for Graph. And here I've got the Microsoft Graph. So when I installed the Microsoft Graph SDK, that also installed this core library as well that all these other libraries are going to be taking advantage of. So now that that's installed, the next thing I did is I went in and I created a new model. So here I have a new event, or a new object here called my event, and it's got a subject and a start date and an end date. And I just defined using some data annotations for customizing how I want this stuff to display. Now, the next thing I did too is that if I went over to my token, over my sample authentication provider helper that I had created and added to the project in the last example, what I then did is if I scroll down to a section here about Graph Client here, I created an instance of the Graph Client, and this is going to be provided by my authentication provider. So I can use this Graph client to make calls. So here I've got our Graph client that's been defined. I'm going to say I'm going to get an authenticated client, and that's going to create a new instance of the Microsoft Graph .NET SDK Graph client. With that, I'm going to pass in a delegated authentication provider, which is going to go fetch an access token from my current logged in instance and then set the header on the request equal to bearer space access token. And so that's what's going to do all the authentication stuff for me to make sure that we're going to get authenticated correctly and so forth. Now, the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to come over and I'm going to look at a controller that I created called my calendar controller. And this one is set up to have an authorization declaration. So you have to be logged in order to use this. And when you go to the index method of my calendar controller, what we're going to do is first have a list where we're going to store all of these results. So I first get a reference to my Microsoft Graph service using that get authenticated client that we just saw a second ago. And I'm then going to use the service to create the query that I want to run. So this query, if I break this up, make it a little bit easier to see, I'm going graph service.me, go to my events collection, and I'm going to issue a request. I'm going to say I'm looking for the top 20 events. Don't skip any events. And we'll just put that back the way it was. And then I'm going to say go issue the request asynchronously. And when I get the results back, I'm going to walk through each of the events in that collection that I got back, and I'm going to add it, convert it to the object that I've defined in my model, which is my event, and I'm going to add it to this event results collection. And when I'm done, I'm going to set that as the collection of events in the view bag. So you see here I'm saying event results, order by, and I'm sorting it based on the start date. The view for this is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to enumerate grab a table here and enumerate through all the data rows to say for each event in the view bag, write out a new row for that item. So let's see how this guy works. So I'm going to go ahead and start running it. And it looks like it's already started in non-HTTPS. So let's go grab the HTTPS endpoint for this. And we'll go back to the browser. And we'll just start over this request. So this is going to go to our web application. I'm going to go ahead and sign out just to make sure that we have a clean token. And then I'm going to click sign in with Microsoft. And that's going to take me to Azure AD to go log in. So I've already logged in once, and it's got, to make my life easier, it's keeping my account still in cache because it's on this machine with a cookie. And once I've signed in, if I go to my calendar controller, we can see now I'm getting a bunch of data coming back from my Office 365 calendar using the Microsoft Graph SDK. So if you want to see all the little steps of how to go through and write this out and everything, you can take a look at the demo that's associated, or the lab exercise that's associated with this screencast in the training materials. But you see now how simple it is to add support to a application to call the Microsoft Graph. The authentication piece is the only prerequisite here. And that wraps up this module. So you've seen how to create an ASP.NET MVC-based application that is leveraging the Microsoft Authentication Library and the OWYN middleware for authentication and identity acquisition. And then finally, how to integrate the Microsoft Graph into your application to call the Microsoft Graph and get information back from your calendar. Now, in all the demos that you saw in this screencast, we were looking at samples that were already built. However, this screencast is part of a bigger training module that's available to you. And in that training module, there is a hands-on lab. And that hands-on lab contains exercises that map to each one of the demos that we did here in this screencast. So if you would like to do this on your own, you're more than welcome to go run through the exercises in the lab to see all this stuff run in person and replicate this same example in your environment. And furthermore, the final solutions are also available in the module as well. So if you just want to poke around in the code, you can do that too. So thank you very much, and I hope you learned something.